what I'm going to be doing is focusing on the kind of the most what I think of as the most important scholarly books that are written within this field. Some of these I hope may be familiar to people. If they're not, hopefully the context will be clear in the talk. But one of the reasons for doing so is that theoretically, at least, scholarly work on this should be the most kind of rigorous, systematic, and kind of total approach to these kind of questions. In 1979, the Yugoslav academic Darko Suvin published a book called Metamorphoses of Science Fiction, which I would argue was, it was really the key book in what became the most powerful single current in theoretically inclined science fiction scholarship. Darko Suvin, very associated with the journal Science Fiction Studies in its earlier iteration, and the paradigm that he sort of instituted was extraordinarily influential. And according to this paradigm, and this is a paradigm, as I say, which overlaps a great deal with the common sense perception in the field. According to this paradigm, science fiction and fantasy are not only distinct as kind of literary genres, they are hierarchically related, and that science fiction is much to be preferred over fantasy. Science fiction, he argued, is the literature of cognitive estrangement. That's a phrase I'm going to be using a lot tonight. Cognitive, in this model, despite some equivocation on the issue, essentially boiling down to a kind of rationalist scientific logic. He talks in a piece around about the same time as science fiction extrapolating and totalizing with scientific rigor. He says science fiction introduces a strange newness, a novum, and it is defined by the narrative dominance or hegemony of a fictional novum validated by cognitive logic. The imaginative framework alternative to the author's empirical environment is cognitively organized. And of the implied others in that model, genre fantasy is particularly savaged by Suvin. He says, although genre fantasy does also estrange, this is, quote, "It is committed to the imposition of anti-cognitive laws. It is a subliterature of mystification, proto-fascist, overt ideology plus Freudian erotic patterns." Where he acknowledges that there are blurred boundaries between science fiction and fantasy, he says that, like, for example, if you go into a bookshop, they tend to be in the same section, and people will often read both. He says that this is rampantly sociopathological and a terrible contamination. Now, although there has been some shift from this position, it is still, I think, the dominant theoretical logic in the field of science fiction studies in various forms. In 2000, he returned to this question in a very important, although very frustrating essay, in which he acknowledged that science fiction is, and I don't, by the way, although I'm going to take issue with this is not. It's a brilliant book, and Suvin is a brilliant man. This is a debate, not a denunciation. Although he acknowledged in his later piece that there was now, in his view, such a thing as fantasy that you had to take seriously. Essentially, the reason for that was it was an unfortunate necessity, because there was simply so much of it, and that it was overtaking science fiction. And he says, the critic may to a large extent rightly dislike this, but essentially you have to do it. Now, put so starkly and with a few quotes mined from various places, it might sound like this is one person's position, but in fact, as I say, this is a very, very tenacious position. The two, I think, most important recent books in the field by Frederick Jameson and Carl Friedman, that's Archaeology of the Future from 2006 and Critical Theory in Science Fiction from 2000, both draw, if not entirely uncritically, on the Suvin tradition. And so for Jameson, for example, and this is, Frederick Jameson, one of the, outstanding intellectuals in the world, fantasy lacks science fiction's, quote, epistemological gravity and is therefore technically reactionary. And Carl Friedman talks about the irrationalist estrangements of fantasy. What I want to do tonight is despite my antagonism to this paradigm, I want to start not with fighting it, but I want to start with submission. I'm going to say that I accept, for the purpose of this argument, I'm going to accept the predicates and the heuristic use of the science fiction fantasy distinction and follow its logic all the way through and attempt a kind of immanent critique of it. Because what I want to suggest is that the conclusions, I hope, won't be sort of paradoxical, but maybe camply dialectical. Because I think that the position's own logic offers an auto-critique, an ideology critique of itself, and in fact collapses the very specificity and superiority of science fiction that it's attempting to argue. So this would be a rebuke to Suvin predicated on absolute fidelity to the Suvin event. So I want to talk about cognition and possibility. Now, it is not new to point out that much of the science in science fiction is wrong. This is a mistaken spurious. This is an old thing to point out. And this has led to a debate about whether or not and the extent to which this disqualifies something as science fiction. And what's interesting is that this debate, in fact, predates the genre proper. You go back to a debate between Verne and Wells, and Verne, comparing their book Verne's From the Earth to the Moon, talking about Wells's book First Men in the Moon, and he says, well, ça c'est très joli. He says, this is very pretty stuff, but he invents things. My science is real. Because he says essentially that what this does is it disqualifies Wells from being a rigorous literature of extrapolation. And you see a similar attitude among some of the more unforgiving readers of what's sometimes called hard science fiction, whereby a scientific fallacy in a book operates as literary dismissal. So the fallacious science in much science fiction is a live question with these issues of what does this mean for cognition, for cognitive estrangement, and so on. Because as I say, although there are occasionally attempts to sort of to hedge it, cognition is basically generally conceived as intimately related to scientific rationalist relationship to reality. And here's where you get into this idea of science fiction as possible, fantasy as impossible. But for example, the critic and indeed writer of science fiction, Adam Roberts, has pointed out that, quote, several of the frequently deployed nova of SF are things that science has specifically ruled out of court as literally impossible. You think about time travel, telepathy, plenty of other things. So scientific possibility itself cannot be the grounds for cognition in the Suvin model. This is impossible. The model can recover from this and does so very elegantly. Roberts himself says that what's important is not the truth of science, it's not the truth of a particular scientific claim, but is the scientific method in making science fiction science fiction. More than anyone, the theorist Carl Friedman has worked at sort of nuancing the sense of cognition in this way as a method, as cognitive logic. And what he says is, quote, cognition proper is not exactly the quality that defines science fiction. What's rather at stake is the cognition effect. The crucial issue for generic discrimination is not an epistemological judgment external to the text itself on the rationality or irrationality of the latter's imaginings, but the attitude of the text itself to the kind of estrangements being performed. So the truth is not so important as the internal argument of the text, if you like. This is very ingenious. It's ingenious for a variety of reasons. One of them, that it is a theoretical systematization of a kind of generic common sense, this common sense that I'm talking about that you see at conventions all around the world, which allows readers to treat faster than light drives as science fiction in a way that dragons are not, despite most physicists assuring us that they are no less impossible.